Welcome, everyone, to our weekly seminar, Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles. I'm James Foster, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, at the Elliott School of International Affairs of the George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., and moderator of today's event, Changes Over Time in the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index, presented by Dr. Sabina Alkire of Oxford, with discussion by Dr. José Manuel Roche of Oxford and Dr. Jaya Krishnakumar of Geneva. By the way, José, do you have a more recent affiliation than that? I apologize.
No, independent.
Fantastic. Great. This is the second in a series of co-sponsored seminars by IIEP and its two partners, the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in the Department of International Development of Oxford University, and the Human Development Report Office, or HDRO, of the United Nations Development Programme. I'd like to express my appreciation to these partners for their help with this series and to the many benefactors of IIEP for their continued support. Now, IIEP is a research institute whose objectives include convening discussions of the key questions facing the international community. For example, our China Conference series recently featured David M. Lampton of Johns Hopkins discussing the deteriorating US-China relations, while on Friday, our Envisioning India series featured Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah with a diagnosis of India's recent slowdown in economic activity. On Friday, our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series brings Oxford to DC when Dr. Sir David Hendry of Nuffield College and Dr. Jennifer Castle of Magdalen joins us for their presentation, Taking Stock of Climate Change, Earth, Air, Fire, and Water. If you miss any of our events from the series, you can watch them asynchronously on our YouTube channel, IIEP GW. The present series is a bit different in that we're examining a key and deepening challenge facing the world, global poverty, through the lens of a relatively new approach called multidimensional poverty, which intends to capture and document the problem of poverty in all its dimensions, thus allowing more effective policy solutions. The goal of this series is to bring scholars together from around the world to take a deep dive into this technology, refining its interpretation and implementation. Last week, Nikolai Supa presented a paper on the sensitivity or robustness of the measure to its constituent parameters, the multiple choices that must be decided before poverty measurement can actually take place. Next week's paper by Elena Sheja will continue how the picture changes when we move from acute poverty, as measured by the global MPI, to a more moderate version, which raises cutoffs and expands the set of the poor to a larger set of moderately poor people. Today's paper views acute multidimensional poverty as a phenomenon through time, looking back on the progress with a discussion thinking, I'm sure, underneath to the future. Today's speaker, Sabina Alkire, needs no introduction as she's the prime motivator behind this approach and the director of Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand it right over to her to both talk about the series for a second and to give an introduction to our two discussants. Thank you so much, Sabina.
Thank you, James, and thanks to everybody who's joining us today. We're really looking forward to this exciting exchange. And as James said, we are really hoping through this seminar series to gather your insights and your reflections on how this body of work about comparable measures of multidimensional poverty using the global MPI, which is jointly released by HDRO and OPHI every year, can be analyzed, can be viewed from different angles, can be improved, and so that its voice carries. carries so far that it can support important actions that affect the lives of the poor, who are all of our concern, particularly in a time post-pandemic. So I'm particularly grateful to our two discussants for taking that charge. Dr. José Manuel Roche was the co-author of the first study published on changes over time with the Global MPI. And he remains very active in this literature. He's worked on child poverty. He's worked in the World Bank and UNDP and many, many different institutions. And so he's the perfect person to think about that blend between the academic work and its voice and how it might carry into policy. And Professor Jaya Krishnakumar at Geneva University, professor of econometrics, has for decades led work that has a motivation from Amartya Sen's capability approach, but tries really to look quantitatively at how we can model these different changes. And we want to go beyond measurement with the Global MPI to look at analysis. What are the determinants? Why did poverty change? Why did 271 million people move out of poverty in India? And what are proper methodologies using cutting edge techniques to analyze the MPI? So a heartfelt thanks to both of them in advance for their advice, and also to you, our listeners, for your advice today and throughout this series. And I'd like to recognize that this paper and the work that underlies it was supported by ESRC DFID and CEDA, and particularly by the then UK DFID, Department for International Development. And so we're also very, very grateful to them. This, like most of OPHI work, is co-authored. And my co-authors are on this call and they will answer all of the difficult questions. But the paper also relies on a great deal of quantitative work by other researchers and colleagues. And we're also grateful to the wider team for that work. So what this paper does is basically takes you in 2 steps through a new database of countries and their trends over time. So we describe the methodology that we use to harmonize and to investigate trends over time. And then we look at, in a sense, the global MPI itself as a standalone set of trends that are quite interesting in our view. And then we look at it in relationship to monetary poverty trends and to trends with different poverty cutoffs. And that work is inspired by Sir Tony Atkinson, who is a leader, was a leader in the field of inequality and world known for it, but also in poverty. His first book on poverty was 1969, and his last book, published posthumously 50 years later in 2019, also addressed global poverty. So I'd like to start with a couple of insights from his book. The first is, in a sense, the motivation. His motivation in writing his last book, Measuring Poverty Around the World, and perhaps also our motivation in trying, in a very small way, to carry forward some ideas from that book. And the idea is very much on this borderline that we need rigorous evidence about the extent of poverty and about the nature, the composition, and the different inter-country trends. But we need it not as a blue skies research, but to spur action and to design effective policies. And he felt that greater understanding of poverty was essential, in a sense, to keep the political agenda active. And he thought so particularly at a time when there's a risk that we become inward-looking and dismissive. And although we have an awareness that poverty has increased during the period of COVID, but also keep the poverty agenda high because there's really danger of it being overshadowed by other important priorities. The other equal motivation was to, in a sense, look at poverty holistically, to include rigorous and up-to-date data and methods for redressing monetary poverty, but also to bring in non-monetary deprivations. And his motivation for doing that was none other than the Voices of the Poor study and how they articulated their needs as well as Amartya Sen's capability approach. And the final observation that I'd like to make, to especially reach out to some in the audience who might not be quantitative geeks who love formula, is Sertoni's appreciation of the way that poverty measurement can be a performance indicator. And he gave many examples through history of how statistical evidence about the nature and extent of poverty was a major factor influencing political action, in part because the politicians were afraid of failing. And our hope again is that in this particular time in history, poverty statistics can be a performance indicator that carries weight. So this paper, motivated by the book, tries to recognize and take forward the need for complementary measures to monetary poverty, that is a non-monetary or a multidimensional poverty measure, and to include in that measure the complex profiles in terms of the composition of poverty. And also, this paper solely focuses on trends and looks at also barriers as well as positive examples. So what is the study? It covers 80 countries and 5 billion people and 647 subnational regions, with decompositions for 78 countries by rural and urban areas, and also other disaggregations. And 3 poverty cutoffs are actually implemented, one for poverty, one for severity, a subset of the poor, and one for vulnerability, a superset of the poor who are near to the poverty line. And there's a separate measure, destitution, which uses a different vector of indicator definitions, which we can talk about later. And then we compare these trends to monetary poverty trends in terms of internationally comparable measures with $1.90 a day and $3.20 a day, and national measures. And we also compare the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index that this paper focuses on with national multidimensional poverty measures in a number of countries. So one of the motivations of doing this is prior research, which showed that the different monetary and multidimensional poverty measures identify different populations as being poor when we have data from the same survey and can match the identity of people or of households. Then even if the headcount ratios of the 2 measures are the same, the identity of the household so identified differ. And therefore, this work tries to carry it forward, but not now matching at the household level, but looking at trends. So what is the global multidimensional poverty measure that we are primarily focusing on for the 80 countries and 5 billion people? It's a measure OPHI and UNDP Human Development Report Office co-designed and launched in 2010. So we are now at our 10-year anniversary with the launch in 2020 of the updates. And it's a measure of acute poverty across developing regions. Primarily, it uses DHS and MIX, Demographic and Health Survey, and multiple indicator cluster surveys, 47 countries each, and 13 countries use national data for a total of 107 countries in 2020. And like the changes over time, these are extensively disaggregated. There are 3 dimensions, as you can see, and 10 indicators equally weighted within each dimension, covering health with nutrition and child mortality, education with completed years of schooling, and with children's school attendance through class 8, and with 6 living standard indicators. These indicators are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 11 in a revision in 2018. So using that data set, we estimate changes, and we do so in a very straightforward way for the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the adjusted headcount ratio, as well as for its consistent sub and partial indices, such as the very familiar percentage of the population who are poor, which is the incidence or headcount ratio, and the intensity and censored headcount ratios showing the indicator composition of poverty. So we primarily look at two different measures of change. The absolute measure, which is simply the difference in values divided by the number of years. So for example, poverty could go down from affecting 70% to 60% of the population, or it could go down from affecting 20% to 10%, and the absolute change of the incidence is equal. Or we could look at the annualized relative rate, which is the percentage of the space distance to zero poverty traveled. So 20 to 10, you've reduced it by 50%. And because we are looking at different year spaces for different countries, we cover between 3 and 12 years, we use the compound or relative annualized rates in order to compare countries in a standard measuring tool. Now, there are lots and lots of caveats which are written in the paper, but I will just mention that, first of all, I mentioned the number of years varies, and some countries do not have all indicators. 62 have all 10 indicators, but some are missing one, and one country misses 2 indicators. There are also harmonization between the countries, so the exact same variable definitions are used in both years, which may mean losing some information in a more recent year if it is more detailed than that we had before. But then there are also exogenous factors that we must really interpret the data in light of, and these include population growth, different migration patterns, domestic and international, shocks, and demographic patterns. And these, for example, changes in the size of the household or the composition of the household. And so these very much affect this analysis of changes over time. And our results are interpreted in light of these changes. So the countries that we look at cover low, middle, and upper middle income countries. They cover all regions of the world, and they have between 3 and 12 years, with the average of around 5.7. The data spans 19 years, and the sample sizes of countries do vary across the ones that we have. And we can talk in the discussion if anyone has questions about the harmonization process, but I must say it's a very labor-intensive process which requires a great deal of concern for the details of the samples of the survey questions, their wording, and what is included and how these might differ over time. So all of what you will see today is strictly harmonized, and so the values may differ from the global MPI standardized information, which is available for the most recent period of time only. These are documented in a methodological note available on OPHI's website by the same authors as the paper now being presented. And we also, as I mentioned, draw from POV-CalNet and World Development Indicators, the complementary data that we will use in the closing section of the paper. So just before we go into the results, I'd like to remind you of how you reduce poverty. So the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which is the primary outcome indicator of poverty on which we focus, is the percentage of weighted indicators. It's the value of the weighted indicators that the poor people experience. And so you reduce poverty by reducing any deprivation of any poor person. If you get any of those deprivations of poor people down, MPI goes down. A simpler way of saying this is you either reduce poverty by taking people out of poverty or empowering them to leave poverty, so reducing the incidence of poverty, or by reducing the intensity the ongoing deprivations of people who remain poor, but now are poor in fewer things at the same time. So the reduction of the MPI captures both, and that is why it is our central indicator when we analyze changes. And in terms of definitions, we focus on the changes in each of the component indicators. And that's a very important point for celebrating what policies have had an impact and where change has gone down, and how these patterns of change might differ subnationally across different population groups. And so given this battery of possibilities, we then analyze the data set to see did the poorest countries or subnational regions reduce the fastest, how did indicator reductions go across country, and so on. So a couple of the findings, and these are taken from our joint report with the Human Development Report Office of the UNDP. First of all, across the 80 countries and 5 billion people, the fastest progress in absolute terms was in Sierra Leone, 2013 to 2017, Mauritania, 2011 to 2015, and Liberia, 2007 to 2013. What you see in front of you is how they reduced poverty. So you see the 10 indicators: health, education, and living standards. And you see the annualized absolute reduction in the percentage of the population who are poor and deprived in each indicator. And you can see, for example, that the red bar, which is Sierra Leone, has a large reduction in nutrition. But years of schooling has a large bar that's orange, which means Mauritania had very big improvements in adult schooling. And the blue, Liberia, got a lot more children in school. So these countries are successes in absolute terms, but how they reached success varies. And so it's not only the level, but it's always the composition of poverty and the composition of changes in poverty, which is very important in a multidimensional arena. If we think of the countries that made the biggest reduction in the distance to zero, the relative reduction of poverty, it was North Macedonia, followed by China from 2010 to 2014, recognizing that those data are a little bit old, and Armenia. So countries with low poverty perhaps are easier to go to make strong relative changes. But the fastest absolute progress was in countries with moderate poverty. The highest was Liberia in 2007 with 82%. So out of the 80 countries, 67% of them significantly reduced MPI at the 95% level. And furthermore, those 67 countries were home to 98% of poor people in the first time period studied, and 97 in 2. This is the first study that we have of 5 billion people. And so it is a positive result. In 13 countries, there was not statistically significant reductions, but the number of poor people in those countries was relatively small. In terms of the incidence or the headcount ratio, only 64 countries reduced it at that level of significance. So the MPI is more sensitive to changes because it also recognizes the reduction of, in a sense, the breadth of poverty, which is parallel to the gap of poverty. And even more countries, 68, had a reduction in the intensity, which is the average share of weighted deprivations that poor people experience. Again, a positive result. And as you see visibly from the graphic, the African countries, which are red in color, had the fastest annualized reduction, had significant annualized reduction, as did South Asia, which is orange. And South Asia's was actually a little bit faster as a region than Sub-Saharan Africa, but those two regions overall had the fastest reduction. And that's important because they also, as you can see visually, were the poorest regions in the initial periods. So the next two slides are just a little bit more detail. Beyond the first 3 countries that I mentioned, which are all in sub-Saharan Africa. Then we move to Timor-Leste, and we also have PDR in East Asia and Pacific region, and Afghanistan in South Asia as being among the 10 fastest to reduce multidimensional poverty. The countries in red also had significant reductions in the incidence of poverty that was among the top 10 fastest. But you'll see that 5 of them did not. Again, so these indicators of incidence and of MPI or multidimensional poverty do not walk in lockstep, which is why it's important to consider both. And the blue indicators were in the 10 top fastest of the headcount ratio, but not of the intensity. And if we move to the annualized relative reduction, we also see the blue countries with the fastest reduction in the headcount ratio and MPI are congruent for the top countries, but not for all of them. So I'd like to spend a couple moments on 2 countries, just giving you an idea of what the database contains. And this is a good moment to say that all of the figures that we are presenting are online with their disaggregations, with their indicator compositions, with their confidence intervals, with their sample size and uncensored headcount ratios on the OPHI website. And also for each of the 80 countries, there is a PDF briefing showing the changes over time for that country. And so if you are particularly interested in one or another, you could go there. So the fastest country, as I mentioned, was Sierra Leone. And it is of particular interest at the moment because that period when it reduced poverty coincided with the period in which the Ebola epidemic raged in that country. Not only did Sierra Leone have the fastest national progress, but it also had some of the fastest subnational regions across all of them. Children in Sierra Leone also had the fastest reduction of children across other countries. So the headcount ratio, which is the most intuitive, fell from 74.1% in 2013 to 58.3% in 2017. So about almost 4% of the population of Sierra Leone per year came out of poverty during that period. And how did that happen? We've already seen, compared to the others, Mauritania and Liberia, how Sierra Leone reduced its indicators. But you can see it very clearly here that nutrition and cooking fuel deprivations, sanitation deprivations, electricity were particularly high in terms of their progress in reducing the deprivations of the poor. But all 10 indicators reduced statistically significantly, and Sierra Leone is one of 20 countries in which every single indicator reduced significantly, and 11 of those countries were in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what happened within Sierra Leone? So this graphic is presented in the country briefings, and on the horizontal axis is the value of the MPI in the initial period, in this case 2013. And the figure actually starts from the top and it goes down. And it's a race to zero poverty. And so the regions that are closest to the bottom have had the fastest absolute reduction of poverty. So it's Kono in Sierra Leone. So what you are seeing is a broadly pro-poor pattern in that the western area urban and the western area rural are the least poor and have the slowest poverty reduction. But it's not perfect because the poorest region, Koinaduga, did not have the fastest reduction of MPI across the subnational regions. So it's not a clear trend. We'll go now to India, another country which is of considerable interest. And in particular, it is because in the decade from 2005-6 to 2015-16, over 270 million people moved out of poverty. There was statistically significant reduction in all subnational regions, also in all indicators, also across different kinds of groups like caste, as well as age. And so it's really a phenomenal story, and we have written up these findings in a paper with Usha Kannagaratnam and Christian Oldegas to have some extra analysis that wouldn't fit in one global paper. But to give you a few of the highlights, the Multidimensional Poverty Index was cut by half in a decade. The Global Sustainable Development Goals call for multidimensional poverty to be cut in half by national definitions between 2015 and 2030. So in 10 years, in a different poverty measure, India showed that this is possible. And that is considering 95% standard errors, confidence intervals. The headcount ratio was cut greatly, but considering confidence intervals not by half. So MPI again is faster and more sensitive to progress because it combines the reduction of incidence and intensity. India's pattern is different than Sierra Leone's, if you can remember that, in that, for example, the reduction of asset deprivations is much higher. This was a period of strong growth in India. And also, again, nutrition is a very, very strong contributor, which is a fascinating and positive lesson. When we move to the states and union territories of India, we again see the reduction with the same axes as before. So the poorest are Bihar and Jharkhand on the right-hand side. But now you see a very strongly pro-poor tendency across these regions. So we feel that this pattern has an affinity with the goal of the Sustainable Development Goals to leave no one behind. Why? If you think about it, the poorest regions are running the fastest. They're reducing poverty the fastest. So they're catching up. So the gap in poverty between the poorest and the richest subnational regions is going down. And it has gone down in a number of the countries that we study, a positive outcome. Just a couple other remarks. I mentioned that there were 20 countries with significant reductions in every indicator. This graphic shows the country that had the fastest reduction in that particular indicator. So the red bar is the level of deprivation in the first year and the orange in the second year. So you can see quite significant reductions across a number of different countries: Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Mauritania, Liberia, but also Malawi, Timor-Leste, Guinea. But there are not only happy stories. For example, one of the difficulties and challenges is population growth. Ethiopia reduced its MPI strongly from 2011 to 2016, and also reduced its intensity particularly strongly. And yet, due to population growth, the number of people who are poor increased by 9%. And Niger, our poorest country in the SDG portfolio, again reduced MPI strongly and intensity very strongly, but the number of poor increased marginally. So 15 countries had increases in the number of poor, despite reducing poverty statistically. So we need to always look at the number of poor as well as the tendencies together, particularly if an MPI is going to be used for targeting and budgeting, because it's the number of poor that must drive those figures. Now we turn to look at the studies that, as Sir Tony Atkinson recommended, map multidimensional poverty reduction using the global MPI with other monetary and non-monetary national and global measures. So a quote from the book, he wanted to know the extent to which the $90 a day tendencies or trends were coherent with evidence regarding non-monetary poverty, using national as well as international measures. And he gave a history of this dating back to the 1950s, and also mentioning that the European concept of social exclusion has been multidimensional. And indeed, he was very involved in those discussions. The reason that he also says not only should monetary and multidimensional poverty measures be considered at the global level, but that nationally owned national income measures or monetary measures and national MPIs should be considered, is that he observed a gulf, a distance between the nationally owned surveys and statistics from statistics bureaus and global ones. And there's definitely an interest in bringing those together, which was a main theme of his report for the World Bank on monitoring global poverty trends. So our maps map the trends in the national monetary headcount ratio, and then two of the global monetary headcount ratios, 320 and 190. Then to have a consistent measurement framework, we also use the headcount ratio when we map MPI, although I've pointed out in several cases that the tendencies or trends of MPI would be more sensitive to progress among the poor than the incidence is. But we use the official national MPI, and many countries now have a permanent official statistic of MPI, which is reported as SDG indicator 1.2.2. And we map the incidence of the global MPI and of destitution, of vulnerability, and of severity, and these with their confidence intervals. If we look across the countries that we map, and those are the countries that have both monetary and multidimensional data, then more than half of the countries reduced the incidence of MPI, and 59 reduced severe poverty. And so we can look at simply the family of indicators that we have focused on so far. But this is an example of all of the indicators. The lines without gray standard error confidence intervals are the monetary measures. So the one on top with square boxes is the 320 a day. The one with round circles is the $1.90 a day. And the triangular figures show the national monetary poverty. And the balls are on the years in which we have data. So they map the trends, linear trends in monetary poverty. And the black lines with confidence intervals are the different multidimensional poverty measures, with the top being the global MPI trends, and then the two that are close to each other being severe poverty and destitution. The one at the bottom goes up, and that's the number of people who are close to the poverty line. So it's not a surprise because poverty went down, and so the number of people who got out of poverty but were still within striking distance of the poverty line went up. So it's not in a sense a worrying, but rather a natural evolution. But it does draw our mind to the fact that some of these gains are fragile, and in a time of COVID, that's of interest. Another example is Timor-Leste, where we see, again, that the monetary poverty trends were increasing and then are decreasing. But that the population in severe poverty and destitution had very steep reductions. Albania is one of a number of countries in which the trends diverged, with monetary poverty showing some increases across the year period for which we have MPI trends, but the MPIs do show a decrease. And that's also the case of a different kind of diversion in Niger. We're just giving you kinds because there's too much data. Niger had a faster drop in the $1.90 a day incidence than it did in the MPI class of measures. Remember though, intensity, not in incidence. And in Zimbabwe, the MPI and the national monetary poverty measure showed a decrease, a mild decrease but the dollar a day and 390 increased. So these are just showing that the different trends across the indicators vary. So the paper has these graphics for all of the countries, and it then tries to analyze across groups of countries what are the different taxonomies that we do in a very first phase and descriptive way. And we recognize that these are absolute reductions, but that relative patterns in relative reduction are also worth considering, but they will differ from the ones that we have pictured. And we also recognize that the analysis that we share is limited because the trend maps look at incidence, but the MPI, of course, captures also the reductions in intensity. So what we would like to invite you to do is sort of say, where do we go next? Beyond this just presentation of the data, presentation of what we can draw out from a first cut, where should we go now in terms of analysis, in terms of the determinants of poverty, in terms of moving towards policies, in terms of more in-depth case studies, and merging these with trends in other variables of interest that might be related to the labor markets or to environment or to conflict and macroeconomic tendencies. So that's very much the spirit of this paper, is to present the achievements, the trends, what can be gathered, but as an invitation to further research, not as a last word. So I close with a slide from Sir Tony Atkinson's book, where he wrote that many years ago there was an advertising campaign for a well-known beer that claimed to refresh the parts that other beers could not reach. So our hope is that this exploration of non-monetary indicators of poverty, particularly of trends in the global MPI, has refreshed you and will also refresh the energy of very tired and overwhelmed policymakers so that they can go that extra mile and fight poverty in all its dimensions. Thank you so very much. Thank you to my co-authors.
Great. Well, that was a wonderful summary of a vast amount of research in your paper. Really appreciate the clarity with which you expressed everything. Really interesting how the contrast between monetary and multidimensionality, it's becoming clearer and clearer. And the idea of being able to create sets of similar looking trends in that respect, it really is very helpful for countries as they try to move forward. I wanted to now ask the people in the audience, as you hear the next two discussants, if you start thinking about questions, please feel free to put them in your Q&A part of WebEx, or that would be probably the easiest way to do it. And in fact, I'll turn it over, I guess, first to Jose Manuel. Jose?
All right, so well, first, thank you for the invitation, and really congratulations to Sabina and to the whole OPHI team of researchers who were behind this paper. I remember working in OPHI, now was, I think, 5 years ago, or something like that, on the first paper on analysis over time. We had at the time 20 countries. Now this paper has, and something before I go into the detail of the number of countries, something I really enjoyed was that link with the Atkinson work and all the exploration of something new around, you know, on the many things that are new in the paper, but the exploration around the work of Atkinson and the taking that forward was particularly enjoyable. And I have to say, from the paper had 80 countries, and it's difficult to overstate it, but the amount of data analysis that went behind this paper is something that is really hard to put into perspective. And it's not only the computation of the MPI in these 80 countries, but also all the work around the standardization between these countries to do it carefully, all the analysis and robustness check that were run after, and then all the supportive material that were produced, everything that is in this database in the OPHI website. And I wanted just to start flagging that point because there is a public good, a public good that OPHI have produced, and that goes way beyond that has slides that I can present in so many different places. So really hats off for that, and I think really thank you for contributing that. And so as I was going to comment on the paper, I thought, well, probably the best I can do is to link it with some of the policy implications. And on the different policy implications, I wanted to put more emphasis on one particular one that is close to my heart and that I've been working quite a bit in the last few years. And that is one that is mentioned by Sabina, and it was covered in the paper, that is the leave no one behind, how to operationalize and monitor these principles. So for those who don't know the leave no one behind, that's a principle that was agreed among member states in Agenda 2030, that is the background to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so member states, in the opening statement of the resolution, they say, as we embark on this great collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind, recognizing that the dignity of the person is fundamental. We wish to see the goals and targets met for all nations and people and for all segments of society. And we will endeavor to reach the furthest behind first. And this is really an incredibly ambitious commitment in the Agenda 2030 that was not there in the MDGs. And for those who follow how this was agreed, well, it wasn't easy, because it shined a light of inequalities. It shined a light in inequality between countries and inequality within countries. And some countries didn't want to name it in that way, and it was hard to approach it. So, and part of the resolution then later shine a light also on what groups these are. And so, of course, geography is one, and then they talk about age, and they talk about gender and ethnicity and race. And so I wanted to start with this because one element of the paper that is really challenging in the measurement side was to do the disaggregation by regions. And there are, I think, over 600 regions disaggregated data in the paper, if I remember well. And this is just an incredible resource to monitor the Leave No One Behind commitment. Among different, of course, but it's one of the resources on looking at the commitment. So I want to just give you a little bit of a flavor of how this, turns into practice. And this is from a paper we just published last week. But in order to put the commitment into practice, you have at least 3 steps. This is an oversimplification, but you need to start by identifying and profiling the poorest and more disadvantaged, and that is precisely what Sabina was doing today in the presentation, and it's partly what the paper does. And then there'll be the prioritization in terms of reform and financing of social programs to close the gap in those countries. And so I just wanted to flag how the MPI can do that. And this is, here I show before the MPI on stunting, and in the paper, they refer quite a bit to Nigeria, which is the case here on the right. And so you can see that in Nigeria, the Northeast region is actually increasing children that are experiencing stunting, whereas the average of the country, at least between 2008 and 2011, is improving. And so the gap is increasing. In Nepal, on the left-hand side, the mountain zone, which is the most deprived region in Nepal, is reducing stunting at least at the same pace than it does the average. And so there's an issue there on how you measure this, and I'm not going to go into detail, but you had different level of depending on how strict you want to assess it. So what I wanted to come back is to the MPI, and Sabina presented some really nice graph. I love the one with India that shows a really good pro-poor poverty reduction, and here is just exactly the same idea with MPI data for Nepal and Nigeria. And what I want to say here is first, this data is there in the OPHI website, it's part of that public good that I was referring to. And for this paper, I just downloaded the data that was there provided. I did a little bit of tweak in order to, well, Nepal can have, or Nigeria can have too many regions sometimes. So I wanted to have something that is more synthetic, and I put some things together, but the data is there available. And so in this graph, I'm not going to explain it much, but it's exactly what Sabina presented. So the horizontal axis is showing the poverty level in the year one, and then the vertical axis is showing how much it has reduced. So in this case, what we see is that there's been a really clear pro-poor in Nepal, where the far west and mid-west region, that are the poorest region, are reducing the fastest. But in contrast, the least improvement. So the best improvement are actually in the region that are already doing better in Nigeria. So there's no doubt that in Nigeria, at least in terms of geography, the north of behind, and that the inequality gap is increasing. And so if we go back to the previous one, there was nutrition. And when you come here, you're actually looking at 3-dimension 10 indicators. So there's a capacity here of into a little more synthetic way. And just to close, something that, of course, is possible to develop more, and this paper does, so many different things, the paper, so it's really, really difficult to say this is an area where the paper can improve. Definitely an area to move forward in that invitation that Sabina makes at the end is, well, to look at metrics of monitoring the leave no one behind, and then also to, in terms of policy, to put those into practice. And so being able to assess what are the groups, what are the marginalized group that are at greater risk of being left behind. And when, for example, when we look at COVID, looking at what are the groups that are experiencing the greatest shocks during these pandemics. And so I stop there, and I really thank again OPHI and Sabina for all the fantastic work.
Great, thank you so much. It was a fabulous, really wonderful. Let's move on to Jaya. I particularly like the context, by the way, was really helpful to give the context of the development goals and what's going on recently. Now, Jaya, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming in loud and clear.
Okay, good afternoon and good morning, depending on wherever you are. First of all, I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this panel discussion. I'm extremely pleased to participate in it, and in particular, very happy to meet Sabina, James, and José Manuel after a long time. So at least virtually meet them. I would also start by congratulating Sabina and her co-authors for the excellent work. I don't have any slides, so it's just going to be, I'm not going to be sharing anything except my own picture, I guess, and that's it. I would like to start by congratulating Sabina and her co-authors for the excellent work, the amount of, the massive amount of data and results in this paper. This is about changes, as we saw, changes over time in the multidimensional poverty index. And as I was saying, it's based on an incredibly rich household database covering 80 countries in the developing world and over 640 subnational regions, and over a full period of about 20 years. I've been, somewhat involved in the past in building data sets from various sources and compiling data sets. And I can really, very easily imagine the massive undertaking it must have been to put it all together. So a big, big, big congratulations to the whole team. In addition to this, the 10 indicators of MPI have been harmonized by aligning the definitions, indicator definitions across countries to make them comparable. So all the 10 MPI indicators are available for 62 of the 80 countries. Now, to give a short summary, I think Sabina was extremely clear, but I guess that will help me to put my points later on. So 67, we saw that 67 of the 80 countries had overall reductions in MPI. And both headcount as well as the intensity of poverty have contributed to this reduction for most of the countries. South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa have had the largest absolute reductions over the period examined, but they still remain among the poorest regions. More than at the national level, I think what are new and really innovative are the results at the sub-national level. They not only show which regions have reduced their poverty levels, but also whether the disparity among regions has declined within a country. And it seems that we do witness regional convergence within many countries. However, the speed of convergence is variable and large gaps still persist. Between rural and urban, poverty in urban areas seems to have decreased less than in rural areas. And another interesting phenomenon is that the positive stories are spread across all regions. There is no one continent doesn't have any monopoly of success. And if you look among the indicators, some have had more progress than others. It is saddening to note, though, that José Manuel also pointed out that child mortality is the slowest among them. And it even, I think, one of the chat, it also came up in one of the chat questions, and that it even increased in some countries. So the picture is not always positive, not always rose. In fact, looking at the number of poor, some of the countries have increased their number of poor, but this is, as Sabina explained, could be due to the population growth. And then finally, monetary and non-monetary measures have been compared. Although it's not always easy to do it because of matching issues, overall, the trends seem to be similar, but the two types of measures do not identify, it's clear that the two types of measures do not identify the same groups and therefore complement each other. Now, much of the, I mean, this is, there's an enormous amount of, analysis done. And so I think it's beyond any summary. It would be very, very difficult to cover all of it. But then I would like to now, as Sabina suggested herself, I'd like to go beyond and see where we can take it further now. And she had a lot of ideas, which I'm going to repeat, but I think I'm going to maybe, elaborate a bit more on all of them, on most of them. Much of the paper is about reporting numbers and percentages and listing countries which are, have done well, have not done so well. So now with such a rich data set, as I said before, I feel that one should and one possibly can go beyond reporting to find patterns in behavior among the different countries. Even staying within descriptive analysis, one can try to find similarities among subgroups of countries. Now, grouping can be done exogenously according to region, for example, geography, continents, for example, or according to demographic characteristics, young populations, old populations, or even along diversity lines, homogeneous populations, heterogeneous populations, and so on. And of course, one can also use statistical techniques to perform clustering based on some key variables, and then try to interpret the evolution of specific clusters, the cluster features, how one cluster differs from another one. Now one can go beyond descriptives to go further into possible econometric modeling exercises, especially exploiting the fact that we have observations over time. And so we can perhaps do some policy impact analysis for specific countries, again, or groups of countries, especially in particular if the period covers years before and after any major policy implementation. What I mean to say, in other words, is that we take a subset of countries that we know have had important policy changes during the period, not only from an economic point of view, could be, like economic point of view, could be like an economic union or trade agreements, but also, in particular, will be very interesting to look at policies in other domains, such as major legal reforms, for example, laws on child labor or laws on gender issues, on gender issue norms, change in gender norms, or even change in political regime, and evaluate the impact of these changes or policies, policy changes. And it would be ideal and easier also to examine the effects of exogenous policy interventions and those that have been administered in a phase-wise manner, over time, so that we have regions who have not had policy change for some period of time, and then we could compare with the regions which have already had the policy change. Although you can also look at poverty reduction, of course, poverty reduction for impact of poverty reduction programs, where it could be, they could be intergenerational issues. They can also be analyzed, especially if you can take into account this selection mechanism, indigeneity due to selection mechanism properly into account in the model, then one can also directly analyze poverty reduction programs. But definitely exogenous shocks can be, I think, analyzing exogenous impact of exogenous policy changes would be an interesting thing to do. And other exogenous shocks could be, which could also be interesting to investigate, are natural disasters, or climate change effects, or even conflicts, although conflicts may not be totally exogenous sometimes. But for these occurrences, one can possibly evaluate the loss of progress in terms of poverty reduction that can be attributed to such events. And especially also, the pandemic is not an exception to this. So the loss, we could produce counterfactual scenarios and compare what would have happened if the shock didn't happen. How would the evolution have been if the shocks didn't happen, and then say this is the loss of progress due to this external shock. And also, again, one can compare countries that may be similar, who have had these experiences, similar shocks, to see how their differences in their coping strategies led to different evolutions of poverty, having experienced similar shocks. And of course, in this period of pandemic that we're all going through, one constantly hears the word resilience. I think this data set, possibly combined with others, by itself too, for example, can be used to link poverty evolution to resilience. That is, study the link or the relationship between countries' resilience, their capacity to resist and recover from external shocks, loosely defining resilience like this, and look at the resilience link of this, the relationship between this resilience and the evolution of poverty, or more importantly, vulnerability, I would say, vulnerability to poverty. And in many places, Sabina and her co-authors, they also mention, inequality, especially looking at the context of regional variation within the country. Again, I think one can take this further and contrast the evolution of inequality with that of poverty for the same indicators. So again, one can possibly, see some patterns emerge among countries who have reduced both, countries who have reduced one but not the other, or countries that have seen increases in both. So we could see some, interesting groupings there. So these are, basically, I don't want to go on very much. So a few ideas that came to mind as I was going through the various, extraordinary findings of this paper. As I didn't go deep into the data set, I wouldn't be able to say whether all these are feasible given the availability of the data, but definitely I think that some of them would be worth exploring. I'm sure there is scope within the data set to explore a lot of these issues. And I would like to conclude once again by expressing my appreciation for the enormity of the work involved in terms of data collection and data scrutiny behind the results of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaya. That was wonderful. A great description of the policy agenda before us, policy analysis agenda, econometrics, and other related techniques to get to the heart of what the causes are and the ways of solving poverty. So, moving to questions. I've received a bunch of questions. Before I do, I'd like to have Sabina rejoin the group here just to reply to the discussants before I start the discussion from the audience in about 2 minutes or so. Sabina?
No, well, thanks, heartfelt thanks to both. I think José's comments on leaving no one behind, on that being the primary motivation, and in a sense, this is potential evidence for it, are apt. And I didn't present, for example, the children. So we have disaggregations by children for every country. So children and adults of children 0 to 9, 10 to 17, etc. And so that kind of convergence can also be studied. And the other thing that was implicit in his messaging, and he very kindly didn't make it so explicit, is that his pictures were prettier than our pictures. And so for people who know data visualization, for people who know how to really communicate, I think that would be something that would be very, very valuable to plug in to this data set. And then for Jaya, I mean, thank you. I was taking notes so fast, I got a cramp in my hand, but fantastic set of ideas. I think for José, I would say that both of you talked about the need to sort of think about how do we generalize across these. And so I was thinking 54 countries did reduce the gap of between their poorest and least poor subnational region. So there's some descriptives, but I think going beyond this to the cluster analysis, identifying subsets of countries, going into more detail, looking at the natural disasters, the exogenous shocks, any natural experiments we might find, looking at the laws of gender and of other topics. I think those are really fantastic suggestions. And so I'm sure my colleagues at OPHI, my co-authors who are better than I at these things also will be capturing them and thinking what we would do. But on the other hand, this is a huge data set. And so we do hope that others will also work on it, because it's many eyes and many minds that will see different patterns and be able to excavate what's relevant.
Excellent, Sabina. Thank you much. Let's begin the discussion from the audience. First, from Jennifer Brinkerhoff, right here in GW in the Elliott School. She asks on Africa, and this is a actually themed triad of questions on Africa. Can we draw any implications from the results that the greatest absolute reductions were all in the African continent? For example, are there greater investments being made there generally, perhaps by MFIs? And then from Bina Agarwal, good to see you back again, Bina. Sabina, thanks for that excellent presentation. I had a question on population increase in SSA overturning some of the positives of poverty reduction. Would you say all of the indicators you should prioritize some, such as female education, since this has an important impact on fertility? So would you say of all of them, would this be one that is worthy of prioritization? And then finally, Thelma Namonje asked the question, what could have been the contributing factors for Sierra Leone to reduce the poverty levels amidst the Ebola epidemic? Sabina?
Thank you so much. So to Jennifer's question, yes, the fastest countries above Timor-Leste were in sub-Saharan Africa in absolute terms. And as you saw, of the 10 fastest countries, bar Afghanistan, Timor-Leste, Lao PDR, many were in sub-Saharan Africa. So that is, as you say, corroborating your observation. Was this due to MFIs? We don't yet know. So that would require getting differential investment information and doing the analysis. But again, it's a wonderful topic to look at, and it's a natural one. But again, if people from GW would like to, we're not greedy. You would be very, very welcome to do so. In terms of Bina's question, that's a fascinating one. So Ushaka Nagaratnam and Nikolai Supa also run the Global MPI. And this year in 2021, they are looking at gendered and intra-household variables for our launch in July with HDRO. And so with that data, we will be able to see, for example, what proportion of MPI poor people do not have an educated woman in their household. And then if we go beyond 2 periods of time, as we hopefully will be able to do this year in some countries, we'll be able to see if a country reduced years of schooling, and if that reduction was among a woman, which we might not know this year, but we will in the future, did that have a knock-on effect? And so I think it's those kinds of questions that these data will be able to address quantitatively soon. But I think in the short period, we'll be able to add a much stronger gender lens. And really, it's your own work, Bina, among others, that's inspired us to do that. And then moving to Thelma's very interesting question about Sierra Leone. First of all, in 2021, we'll be able to update Sierra Leone using 2019 data, which will give a more complete picture about the trends through a longer time period. We do not know. We've talked with the government, and the government was on our MPPN, our South-South network of 60 countries, to explain Sierra Leone's reduction. We've talked with the UN agencies because clearly the Ebola pandemic was a time of very strong international interest and assistance. But there's no clear story yet of how the reductions happened. And so we are actually going to take that as an academic project. And again, people with inside information, please do be in touch. But we're going to try to do a proper study to understand what went right in Sierra Leone, particularly because what people say is that it wasn't perfect, that there were mistakes, that maybe some of the reforms were not deep enough, institutionalized enough, and yet they did make a difference. And so being able to tell a nuanced story that's neither black nor white, but a work in progress, I think will be interesting when it comes to Sierra Leone. Over, James.
We have a question here. Thank you, Sabina, which says, thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering if you observe more pro-poor trends as the one you showed us from India. And I add to that a little bit. Could you clarify, just so that we can make sure we know what you found, whether the pro-poor trends were relative or absolute, whether the distances were absolutely compressing or whether they were compressing relative to their sizes? Those are the two questions.
Right, so what I shared was absolute reductions. And those are the ones we've analyzed more, primarily because they are more relevant in the poorest regions, because more difficult to get a relative reduction in very poor regions. And as I mentioned, if you look subnationally, 65 countries had the subnational breakdown, 60 countries of 647 regions. 405 of those regions had a statistically significant reduction, but in 54 of those countries, the gap between the poorest and the least poor went down. So that's something that we have tapped into. For example, if you look at Indonesia, or if you look at Bangladesh, those are two other countries like India that have very strong pro-poor trends. But as José showed in the case of Nigeria, there are others that are very much in the other tendencies. And those are the ones that are very worrying, whether it's subnational, whether it's rural, urban, or whether it's children. We have to say that the story is mixed. But I think that figuring out how to synthesize those, figuring out, given that all the subnational regions have different population shares, and also that different countries have different numbers of subnational regions, we're really reaching out for a methodology that enables us to do a comparison that's not silly. And so that's why the pictures and the country stories are where we're at right now. Because anything that pretends everyone has the same number of regions or the regions have the same population shares is empirically inaccurate. Thank you.
Thank you. From Daria Mendola, a more technical question, but one that I think leads into the second question. We have here, the question is, says, thanks for this interesting presentation. My question, is there any sort of compensation among the dimensions of MPI? In case there is, how did you control for this? And then the question from Syed Waqar Shah, how important do you think it is for developing countries to recognize the reliability of the MPI?
Okay, fantastic questions. So in terms of compensation, we linearly report the reductions in the deprivation dimension indicators of poor people when we look at the reduction of MPI. And the reason is that there are not the same relationships across different countries, or across the same country at different periods of time, or across different population groups within a country. And so the most direct way of tracking change is simply to keep each dimension one by one. That being said, these Sustainable Development Goals advocate integrated policies, multi-sectoral policies, where you do try to look at efficiencies in reducing indicators synergistically. And so what we try to do is use the MPI, first of all, at the moment, simply to analyze the indicators one by one in terms of reduction, but in terms of forward planning to encourage them as a tool for integrated policies. This is a moment to say that child mortality does have the lowest absolute reduction, but that is actually because child mortality in its new definition since 2018 is defined as a household that has lost a child, that is a person under the age of 18, in the last 5 years. So the proportion of people who live in households that have lost a child in the last 5 years is very small. And so in that case, the absolute reduction does not mean that it was slower than other indicators in relative terms. It simply reflects that the definition is much more stringent than it was prior to the realignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, to the last question, which I'm gathering again.
Right, about the importance of the MPI having, a sense of reliability, and whether this is important for developing countries.
Yes, I think in terms of reliability, what we explore, and Nikolai Supa's paper last week gave an example to it, the extent to which the parameters such as cutoffs and the weight and the poverty cutoff determine relationships, for example, among subnational groups or among countries, or the extent to which, if you modify those parameters, the country rankings subnational patterns are the same. And so in terms of the work on robustness, and we have a different paper on that, and on sensitivity is one example. The other kind of reliability would mean, in a sense, over time. And what we're showing now is that hopefully poverty is not reliable. Poverty can go down, it can reliably respond and reduce to different kinds of interventions. And so one of the appeals of the MPI is that it's much more sensitive to social policy changes than a monetary measure.
Great. So I have a question from Melba Tutor. Hi, my question pertains to concrete policy implications, specifically budget and connections between interventions that address the MPI indicators. For instance, given a certain poverty profile, what combinations of interventions would bring poverty down in the most effective manner considering budget? Is it more expensive to reduce nutrition deprivation vis-a-vis electricity, and the interconnectedness of indicators that constitute the MPI? For instance, interventions that address school attendance might also address years of schooling. Do we have exercises like this? And I should mention that there was also a question previously that asks, we see health deprivations appeared to have fallen the least. Now, you've just addressed one part of that question, but in general, if you have one set of indicators that fall the least, could it be that it's because governments are focusing on the other ones in their policy? And therefore, that's what's happening here. Or could it be that they just can't be reduced very much, like you've just stated for the case of mortality? So go ahead and respond to those two, if you can remember.
Yes, so for the second one, the nutrition variable, as I showed in the case of India and Sierra Leone, has moved quite a bit in certain countries. And remember that the nutrition variable weighs 3 times as much as a variable, for example, of assets. And so reducing it greatly will move the MPI 3 times more than an equivalent reduction in percentage points of any single living standard indicator. And so the changes in nutrition are what are driving progress in that dimension in empirical terms because of the cap, in a sense, on the child mortality. But in terms of budgeting and the integrated policies, that's a very interesting question, and it's a good example of how the MPI can be a policy planning tool. Both the global MPI that I've shared here, but also national MPIs, which are official permanent statistics that national governments create using their own data sets and their own variables, often including, for example, work or shocks or the environment. And Nora Lustig's work or public expenditure literature can be combined with the MPI. So to do that, of course, you need to look at unit costs, the marginal costs, and also the costs of reaching the last mile, which could be more expensive. You have to then look at how unit costs go down when you combine interventions. And when we give examples of this to countries, we often use the example of the number of people that were deprived in every indicator. And in the slide, they present exercises using the MPI as a tool. They had the costs one by one, and then of certain combinations. And so there are, as you say, are cost savings if nutritional benefits are delivered in schools as an incentive, but also to obtain nutritional supplements while they are there. Then that's a very common example of an integrated intervention. Really focusing on using MPI to set a target and to influence policy, are looking at these synergies, which can train staff so they can travel to a distant region and then talk about more than one intervention. Having different programs in the same place. So those kinds of interventions, and what I was mentioning with
Thank you. We have a question from Bo Bachansky-Peterson. And Bo asks, on Nepal and Nigeria, don't forget that some of the surveys were really not achieving full coverage, especially in the poorest regions. On the analysis in general, which I greatly applaud, it's only really as good as the underlying surveys. And so that was just a question about coverage and how do you deal with that, I suppose, as well. And plus going on to Tim Conway, still covering the question of data availability. Looking ahead, are we worried about having a longer than expected gap between survey points if DHS, mix, and national equivalent surveys planned for 20 or 21 are not fielded because of COVID-19, or even beyond if there's not enough funding? Could you comment on both of those, Sabina?
Yes, and thank you very much to Bo Peterson in UNICEF and in the mix office, who's been a fantastic colleague and companion in work on multidimensional poverty analysis, particularly using the mixed surveys. And it's absolutely right that we try in the methodological note that I mentioned to highlight particularities of each data set that are included in these 80 countries. And in maps, for example, if a particular region of the country is not covered subnationally, then we try to reflect that in the subnational maps when we illustrate those. So that's a point well taken, but any suggestions or any oversights that you see, we are welcome for your inputs. And to Tim Conway's comment, we are concerned, naturally, because we are just so grateful to the Demographic and Health Survey team and to the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey team for their data. We're talking of public good, having a public good of microdata that's free, that's available, high quality, harmonized, well documented with all of the meta information that you need. That's a humongous resource, and we could do nothing without it. Usha Kanagaratnam informs me that 18 countries, we already have their data to update this year, and that there are a number of countries with mixed and DHS surveys in the making. We're not sure which of them will come out in time for the MPI 2021, but we are again grateful and admiring, but the surveys do seem to be continuing. But funding data, and particularly for household survey data, because the data is very important and one to explore, but big data don't necessarily look at the same deprivations that are striking the same person at the same time. And that's one of the oversights of that. And so we cannot do the work that we do simply with assorted data. We need to bring it down and ground it in the life of a poor person, of a family, a household. And so we do hope that survey funding continues because it's vital for this work. And without the data, we could not do the work.
Now, I know we're over, but brief questions to finish. First, we have from the anonymous chat, it'd be great to explore if there's any correlation between these findings and governance indicators. Secondly, there's again, Tim Conway suggests, what about synthetic panels? It might be quite useful. Could this tell us something interesting when we don't have panels?
Yeah, no, fantastic. And I'll be brief, but I certainly appreciate it. In terms of synthetic panels, we have a paper using the actual longitudinal panel of EU silk and finding a ginormous degree of volatility in a mere 4-year period. A large proportion of the European population were poor one of those years, but only 16% all 4 years running. And so we want to, first of all, analyze existing longitudinal data in other countries to see if these patterns are confirmed with other variables. But synthetic panels would also be interesting. We simply have not gotten there, and others might have more experience in them. So no, thank you very much for a wonderful panel of questions. And there's a bigger agenda ahead of us than there is behind us. But we do hope that others will join in this work and use it for your own research and purposes.
Thank you so much, Sabina. That brings today's seminar to a close. I want to thank you in particular, Sabina Alkire, for your influence, for your direction, your guidance in this area, for continuing to bring us all kinds of magnificent results on poverty around the world, thus making it possible to address the global poverty. And to José and to Jaya for just some wonderful discussion comments, and of course, the audience, as always. Thank you very much for your input, and goodbye from the Multidimensional Poverty Seminar for this week. Bye-bye now.